Hello. Before we get down to cinema, I would like to draw your attention to our Patreon. Regular listeners will know that these podcasts are supported by Quad, our home cinema in Derby, UK. But as Quad is a charity, we want to make Cinelit as self-sustainable as possible. So, to that end, we have set up a two-tier way in which you can support Cinelit. For our 35mm Cine fans, you'll get a bonus additional episode each month where we will be deep diving into an area of cinema that will be exclusive to Patreon subscribers for at least 6 months before it arrives like a late dinner guest on the regular feed. Plus, you get the episodes a week in advance of the main feed release. But if you want to support us and don't feel that pressing need to have the additional podcast each month, but still want that warm, satisfying feeling of being part of the Cinelit success story, then you can become an 8mm Cine fan, where you can donate and get our heartfelt thanks. Head over to the Patreon page and subscribe if you can. However, we know that times are hard at the moment, so please do not feel you need to subscribe if you are not able. We'll still be putting out new, free-to-listen-to episodes on a regular basis throughout the year. Now let's get back to your regular scheduled broadcast. Welcome to the latest instalment of the never-ending soap opera that is Cinelit. This week we are asked the ages-old questions. Why do musicians try and act? I am your host, Adam Marsh, and I'm joined by Cinelit's resident expert, Daryl Buxton. How are you, Daryl?
I'm good, thanks, Adam. Yeah, looking forward to this one. Last time was Bowie, so now we're opening the field a little bit.
Bowie and others, as the schedule permits. As we're looking at musicians who cross over and dabble into acting, I thought it would be prudent to have at least one person on the podcast who can play something more intricate than Farah Jacka. So we are delighted to welcome to the podcast Rob Lane from the Straight to Video podcast, and, vitally important, someone who is actually a musician. Welcome, Rob.
Thank you ever so much, Adam. Great to be here. I appreciate you having me on board.
Cool. So, do you want to tell our vast army of listeners a little bit about your podcast?
In the last, during lockdown, like most musicians seem to do, I decided to venture into the world of podcasting, something I've been thinking about for probably about 5 or 6 years since getting hooked on Kevin Smith's podcast back in the day. He was one of the OGs, if you like. So he kind of set the seed. And I just decided to get chatting to some of my musician friends, all about how they grew up and the path that they kind of took, and I just tied it in with my whole straight to video retro music movie soundtrack project, which I've had for a few years. So everything's available at stvpod.com. That's the only plug I'm going to do. So I'll get in and I'll get out.
Well, it's a wonderful mix of hard rock and Transformers. I guess if you want to look at that kind of stuff. It's a great podcast. You had a guy from Thunder on a couple of.
That's right. Yeah.
Weeks ago, which was. I'm harkening back to my teenage years, listening to Thunder, watching that 1990 Donington performance. It's like, oh my God. Yeah.
One of the greatest.
Yeah, so it's back to my teenage years, threw me right back there. But we're not talking about that today. We're talking about those kind of acts who decide to try and act. So we're looking at musicians rather, who transition or try to transition into acting. As Daryl said, we did the David Bowie one a couple of weeks ago, and Bowie is probably one of the more successful musicians who transferred into acting. Daryl on the podcast last week, Rob, professed his hatred for Labyrinth.
Wow.
Yeah, see, I knew you'd be on my side with that one.
Now that's what you get on Cinelit. You see, you get conflict. So we don't always agree. So welcome to the bear pit.
I'm ready.
So where should we start? I mean, I looked at the vast list of actors that have musicians that have transitioned into acting, and I thought, well, Mick Jagger would be a good start. I didn't start with performance. I started with Free Jack. Arguably his peak of his acting career, the job he took 1 week before filming started. That was. And to be fair to Mick, he's not the worst thing in that film.
What year was that?
That was 1992, and it was. It was
going to say like 86 or 87 or something. It
just looks that way. But it was like Sir Anthony Hopkins' first role after he won the Oscar for Hannibal Lecter, and he went straight into Free Jack. It was like,
Now, as we speak, he's just won this year's Oscar. So does that mean we're going to get Free Jack 2 in 6 months' time?
We're going to get the 21st century equivalent of Free Jack, I think.
A reboot.
Yeah.
Free Jack reboot with a cameo.
Yeah, with a plot that makes sense, that is not blatantly obvious as soon as it starts. Yeah, but as I'm watching, and he's not bad. He's got a little bit of the charisma. It's a terribly written film, so you can't really judge him too harshly. But he brings some of his charisma to that role.
That's right. It's not a film that it's a bad film anyway. It's not a film that is bad because the pop star wanting to be an actor brings it down, which is probably going to be the case in some of the others that we talk about. But in this case, Mick's okay. As you say, he's not the worst thing in it, is he?
No.
Probably going to fall from the curse of films which were released in that weird mid-90s period, which very few hold up these days. You wonder what some Hollywood decisions were during that period of time.
I think a lot of it's down to the special effects. I mean, they all look like they're straight out of Lawnmower Man. That kind of that cyber effects.
Adam, it was groundbreaking.
It was groundbreaking. It still looks terrible now. Yeah. To be fair, it looked pretty terrible then. Even with the sort of like groundbreaking effects, I think it was like. Ugh.
I think only one film gets a pass with groundbreaking special effects, and that was Last Starfighter, which looked terrible, but at the time they were genuinely groundbreaking.
I love Last Starfighter. The fact that it hasn't been remade is astonishing, quite frankly, when they've remade literally everything else. They're literally going around the empty cave like Daffy Duck looking for that last bit of gold, and there's the Last Starfighter right in the corner. What's going on? Why haven't you remade me? With
one of the strongest storylines of any sci-fi film going.
Exactly. High concept idea. Come on, get on with it, Hollywood. I know you're listening.
Yeah. So on Mick then, what do we think? We're saying he's not the worst thing in Free Jack. What do we think about his other big roles? Because he did Ned Kelly and Performance around the same time in the late 60s, early 70s. So what do we think of Mick as an actor in general? Because he's not done a lot, and which is a good choice, I think. Do
you think these were like agent decisions or Mick decisions?
Oh, that's a good question.
This will be great for your career, Mick. The music's quietening down. This is the next step.
I reckon it's not. I reckon maybe the 90s one, it was like, maybe you should think about moving into acting. The albums are not selling as well. But the tours always sold really well, didn't they? Rolling Stones, they were always like the biggest touring outfit in the world throughout the 80s. So I bet every time he took on a film role, an agent's going, "No, that means you can't tour for 6 months." So
that's true.
So I think probably the agent's tearing his hair out every time he picks up a screenplay.
Yeah, but it's odd that he's done so little, really. Because he's obviously interested in film, even to the point where he produced Enigma a few years ago. So every now and then he sort of gets the bug, and but he's not a David Bowie. He's not someone who needed to do it like twice a year,
No, I mean, the 60s ones feel like they were separate to the rest.
Yeah.
They feel like they were ones that in the 60s, everyone's doing it. Music wasn't as big a paying job as it became in the 80s, particularly for Mick Jagger. It wasn't as big a paying job in the 60s. So it was like, well, you got to diversify. You got to do bits of bobs here and there.
And of course, what you had in the 60s was your sort of post-Beatles movies in the main, certainly in Britain, where Hard Day's Night and Help had come out. And I'm sure we'll talk about some of the better examples of that as we go on. The Dave Clark 5 film is particularly good. Catch Us If You Can, but it seems every band, Spencer Davis was doing a sort of haunted house movie called The Ghost Goes Gear with Nicholas Parsons and Acker Bill, and that's the sort of thing you're getting in the 60s. And so Mick was obviously thinking, well, if the Stones do a movie, it ain't going to be like that. It's not going to be some piece of junk, it's not going to be something like Gonks Go Beat or something like that. And then the script for Performance comes along, and he must have thought, this is something, this is different, this isn't A Hard Day's Night, this is the sort of thing I want to do. You can see the appeal
Well, it feels like it's a very different type of proposition. It was like, you know,
it's a proper film, I guess.
It's a proper film, but it's also it's a role for Mick Jagger. It's not a Rolling Stones movie, where, you know, the Beatles movie. It's all about the Beatles running away from fans, that kind of stuff.
Oh, they were all kind of going with the hype and the mania at the time, weren't they? It's like,
yeah, absolutely, yeah. But this felt like it was just a side project. And, you know, take that as you will, as a Rolling Stones fan. What are you doing acting? Go away. You can come. When's the next album out? You know, that kind of mentality. But for Mick, it's a proper role, proper director. You know, well respected director, and you know, it was well received.
Yeah, and still it still is to this day. You know, it's regarded as one of the highlights of his career, which is saying something.
Yeah. So should we get into the 60s films then? Because they kind of set the template for a lot of movies, particularly Hard Day's Night. I mean, Hard Day's Night, the story of the everyday life of the Beatles and the band is replicated time and time again. Insert latest pop band, Spice Girls, insert, you know, Monkeys, whatever, you know.
Yeah, well, mentioning the Spice Girls there, I think there are clear sort of bookends there, because I think A Hard Day's Night kicked off a certain type of pop movie, and Spice World probably ended it. And I think they both films have got their merit, you know. But and in between there was a lot of dross, but the occasional decent film involving a band, or occasionally you'd get movies involving several bands, you know. And but yeah, I think Hard Day's Night is a massively important film, because we previously had, I mean, the 50s rock and roll movie had been big in America. It had sort of hit Britain with people like Tommy Steele and Cliff Richard. But then you've got things like The Girl Can't Help It coming out in America, which didn't have rock stars acting in it, but it sort of had them as sidelines. It dragged them on and sort of interspersed them with the plot, which was a genius way of getting Eddie Cochran and Little Richard and Fats Domino on screen. But then suddenly there was this idea, I suppose it started with Elvis, really. There was this idea that, hey, we'll get these guys into acting. And maybe that stemmed from going back as far as the 20s or through the 30s and 40s, certainly up to the 40s, where you've got figures like Bing Crosby and Frank Sinatra. And even people like James Cagney and Fred Astaire, who were sort of seen as being a bit of, they can sing, dance, act, play serious roles, do comedy, do a bit of everything, you know.
All-round entertainer.
And I suppose we had that then in the 50s with Tommy Steele and Cliff, you know. But yeah, Hard Day's Night was something very, very different. Again, as we've just said about performance, it was a real movie with a proper director. And the great thing about it is it really played on, as you've just mentioned, Rob, the Beatlemania and the whole you know, fan thing. And so it was a film about the Beatles, but it was about a heightened version of the Beatles.
Yeah, exactly what Spice World became as well, really. It was just totally took the blueprint.
I think these films are great, where you get the people playing themselves, but they're sort of playing movie character versions of themselves, you know. And I think Hard Day's Night really set the template for that.
See, that answers my what was going to be my next question. Are they acting? Is this a case of when it's called When Musicians Act? Are these cases, are they actually acting, or is it more a case of like playing themselves?
Do you think? I think there's a difference in these films. I think sometimes, especially, you know, when you've got the drummer who doesn't want to be there anyway, and they've had to get up at 5 o'clock in the morning, they're just going to sort of mooch along after everyone else in whoever it is, the Dave Clark Five or Herman Sirmich. You know, the bass player's not going to be interested. But I think in the Beatles, all four guys, as we've seen since, have shown an interest in movies. They've all gone off and made their own movies. George Harrison had his own movie company, for God's sake, you know. And so I think right from the start, and of course John Lennon and Paul McCartney have both said that there might not even have been a Beatles had it not been for The Girl Can't Help It, Frank Tashlin movie, which they went to see when they were teenagers. And they loved seeing Eddie Cochran and Gene Vincent on screen. And they went back to their own band, the Quarrymen, started copying what they'd seen in The Girl Can't Help It.
Wow, I never knew that.
Yeah. And they both admitted that in interviews. They said, if it hadn't been for that movie with Jane Mansfield, we we probably would have formed a band, but we wouldn't have done all the rock and roll moves and worn the leather and everything, you know. And so Hamburg wouldn't have happened, and the rest wouldn't have happened. And so I think they were obviously film fans as kids, you know, and I think they brought that into A Hard Day's Night. And of course, you've got Richard Lester there, who'd already worked with people like the Goons, who the Beatles were fans of. So they'd have known Richard Lester's work. And you're getting this mesh, you know, it's this tight unit that's working together, and they all know what they're doing, and they're all aiming for the same thing. And that thing is to take the piss out of Beatlemania, which I think the film does brilliantly.
You could almost argue that musicians or bands within that format, you say, are they acting or are they just playing like a overblown version of themselves? You could say, in a way, musicians are acting anyway when they go on stage. A lot of people say that it's their alter ego when they're on stage. It's like you meet them off stage, they're nothing like that, the character which they're playing on stage. So it's probably just turning the volume up just a little bit when it gets on screen. That's perhaps all it is.
Yeah, dial it up to 11 to move another movie
Tap.
quote. Spinal Tap, yeah. I don't know. I feel like that there's a real difference between Mick Jagger in performance and all those kind of movies that we've just been talking about in that way, where they're playing themselves and it's a version of themselves on screen. I think I think John Lennon did a little bit of acting in the 60s.
How I Won the War again for Richard Lester. So,
so you know, so I think that's different to the stuff he did. Particularly in Hard Day's Night. I think Help is a very different proposition, and I think the Monkees' Head movie is a very different movie as well.
Yeah. Well, Head is a film you can tie in with the Catch Us If You Can, actually, the Dave Clark 5 film that I mentioned earlier, because they're both very, very cynical about the business, and the whole point of the movies is to sort of almost destroy rock and roll from within, you know, and to sort of say, look, we're manipulated musicians who are being told what to do, and we're going to make a film about that. And that happens in both the case of Catch Us If You Can and Head. I think they're great sort of twin movies for that. So if you're looking for the ultimate cynical movie music double bill, there it is, you know. Head's a bit more sort of psychedelic and freewheeling. Catch Us If You Can takes the British angle. It's directed by John Borman, very early film for him. And it goes almost down the sort of kitchen sink type route, you know, and it's all set in the world of advertising, which tells you all you need to know about the sort of cynicism and manipulative qualities of it. And the band are sort of being pushed into different sort of having to make commercials and do promotional films, and being told where to go by their manager and stuff. And the movie's all about that. It's all about their reaction to that and saying, look, we don't want to do this. And Head sort of does the same thing, but in a way that's a bit more sort of cartoony and colourful. You know, I mean, Catch Us If You Can's in black and white for starters. So it's right in the middle of that British sort of kitchen sink period, and it feels like it. It's a very dour, sort of downbeat movie, you know. And but yeah, I think that and Head are basically saying the same thing. And I think what you've got there is the band's playing themselves in the same way that the Beatles do in their movies, but the message is different, and it's clearly coming from the bands are obviously thinking this. They're right in tune with what the films are about, and they're delighted to have the chance to say, look, it's a shit business.
Why? Why would they do that? You're popular musicians and you make a film talking about how shit the business is, and about how everything you see that you love is wrong.
If you think about this, you get bands doing this on records. You get to how many songs are there that are the band writing a song about how much they hate the record company. I don't know why they do it, because it seems like career suicide, but I
think there's probably enough for a record company to put together a double album and release it and make money off it. And if they haven't, they're missing a trick.
Is it a case here in the movies and in the songs of everyone's a winner, because the bands get 5 minutes where they get a chance to feel like they're off the leash and nobody's telling them what to do. And the record company or the movie company or whoever it may be, or the commercial company or whoever, are thinking, well, nobody's listening to the message. All they want to know is that we've got Sting or we've got Madonna in front of the cameras, or whoever it may be. And there is almost that sense that the record company or the movie company don't mind they sort of feel like nobody's going to listen to this message anyway. They just want to go and see the pop stars on film, or listen to the records. They don't care what the song's about, They don't
listen to the songs that closely, I don't think.
I think there's that sense to it, definitely. So everyone comes out feeling they've won,
So all the artists think they're getting one over on the record company. The record company feel really bad while they're counting the money.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's it in the nutshell. Yeah.
Right. Okay.
It's what's in the contract.
Yeah. So we've got like, as I say, we've got quite a dour kitchen sink style drama from the Dave Clark Five. Fast forward like 10 years or so, and Slade did a very similar thing with their movie, In Flame.
Yes.
Slade in Flame. Yeah. So Slade, known as the cheeky Midlands chappies, can't spell properly and having #1 hits and Christmas songs.
They were offered the chance to do this film called The Quite a Mess Experiment, which is obviously was going to be a science fiction spoof on Quatermass. They didn't like it, mainly because I think Dave Hill got killed off in the first 10 minutes.
That's fine. Like, well, I'm fine with that.
Yeah. he wasn't though, and the band were a sort of unit, and they thought, well, if we're going to do a movie, we want to do something that we all do together, And then the Flame got offered to them, and well, what a film! It's you were talking earlier, Adam, about real films as opposed to pop star jaunts sort of thing, and this looked as though it could have easily been it's Slade having a bit of fun in a movie. It's nothing like that. It's horrible. It's ghastly, and it's a proper,
in a good way.
It is. It's a proper downbeat drama. And what a film it is! Again, there are genuine performances from the band. They're not playing Slade; they're playing another band, which adds that little bit of distance. I think you're getting genuine performances out of them as far as possible.
That's one that passed me by. That is, I never realised Slade did a movie. That's crazy.
Oh, Rob, see it!
Yeah.
It's great.
It is great. And the album that Slade did for it is arguably their best. I mean,
yeah. Yeah, and again, it's got none of the hits on, and it's got all the sort of melancholy songs that they start, stuff like "How Does It Feel" and things like that, and they tie in with the tone of this movie brilliantly. It's all about the death of rock, and about how terrible the industry is, and real sort of rise and fall stuff, And I suppose we'd had just before then we'd had the twin assault of the brilliant, the equally brilliant two films with David Essex as the Jim McClane character in That'll Be the Day and Stardust. And again, Stardust is as grim as it gets in terms of.
Isn't Ringo in one of those?
Yeah, he is. He's in That'll Be the Day, and of course he directed Mark Bolan in the Mark Bolan movie Born to Boogie, which was just a straightforward, if you can call a biopic of T-Rex straightforward. It was basically T-Rex the movie. It was film of them in concert and so on. That must have been weird for Ringo, because there are shots in Born to Boogie where you see T-Rex on stage and Ringo's there filming it as the director. And you've got this cinema or theatre or whatever filled with screaming girls, and Ringo sort of behind a camera 10 yards away, and you're thinking, well, 5 years ago they'd have all been screaming at you, mate. Now they're screaming at this guy with corkscrew hair. I think in terms of dramatic films and in terms of what we're talking about, in terms of pop stars acting, I think Britain in the mid-70s was really where it was at. And again, David Essex, in his two movies, David Essex had already formed a bit of a pop career. He'd had hits with things like Rock On. So, but what a great fit he was for this, and how good is he in them? I think he's great.
When we talk about those sort of like 70s glam, Rob, you just mentioned it then with like not knowing Slade had a movie. I don't think there was the glam rock movies, and there's quite a few of them.
Yeah,
I don't think they're as well remembered or even remembered at all.
I remember them, but then I think it's people who are sort of cult movie fans and people who've got weird taste in British films love those movies. And yeah, other than that, I think they've sort of faded away a little.
I think the only 70s movie I remember is Kiss meets Phantom of the Park. That's the only one.
Which was the sort of American version of what these British films had been. Very, very much. Yeah. Kiss were ideal to make a movie. Exactly. This is one thing we were talking about when we were sort of preparing for this podcast, though. We were discussing, why did all the glam rock bands get to make movies? And there are ones where there's a great film, big favourite of mine, called Never Too Young to Rock, which has got the Rubettes, the Glitter Band, Mud, and Bob Care's Whoopee Band in it. So you've got, and other artists as well, and you get these sort of jamboree type films where you get 5 or 6 artists involved. There's a film called Side by Side as well, which does the same thing. But what we were talking about is Kiss made a movie, but why didn't the British, the sort of heavy rock bands make films? I would love to see Black Sabbath in a haunted house. That would be amazing. But why did Zeppelin never? They were interested in the occult and Aleister Crowley and stuff like that. Why did Led Zeppelin and Black Sabbath and all of the other bands that were coming through at the time never want to sort of dip a toe into fictional film and do a movie?
Makes you wonder if there were ever an offer there from people and they just said no, or
probably with Peter Grant, and considering the management they had, Peter Grant with Zeppelin, Don Arden with Sabbath, maybe it was a case of the managers just not letting a film company anywhere near their charges.
But even back then, certainly during the 70s and 80s, a successful band was on that cycle of tour, record. It was a constant cycle for whether the record company was pushing for that back then, which I would imagine it was, because you heard about so many bands getting burnt out because they just 2 weeks after a tour, they had to go straight in and record the next album. It's like rinse and repeat for as long as they could.
I mean, with all the bands we've mentioned there would be at least one album a year, wouldn't there? Mm-hmm. Bowie was sometimes doing 2, but with Sabbath, it was like there was that conveyor belt aspect to it, wasn't there? And that I think that all came from very strong management and from record company demands. Mm-hmm. I think you're right there. The 2 things that might have been going on were one, the management being very, very strict about what their acts did, and secondly, the record company just wanting them on this constant record tour.
Probably contracted for 5 albums, and they were hearing stories which were happening on the road, and we need to get these albums out quick before this band explodes. Or our contract's screwed.
They're all approaching 27 quick.
Because I think we know that Zeppelin eventually did a concert movie. The Song Remains the Same, and it had little fantasy drama sequences in it. So there was clearly the drive there that they were interested in doing something like that. And then Ozzy, once MTV came along, and that whole getting in front of the camera became part of the music biz. You couldn't keep Ozzy Osbourne away from it, and so he obviously knew that he could play up to his image. But it's such a shame that he didn't get the chance to do that in a movie in 1971,
Do you think that maybe it got to that stage where that the artists like Zeppelin, like Sabbath, were a bit too big for an independent production, but equally not too big for Warner Brothers or Paramount to say, yes, let's make a Sabbath movie? Yeah,
I think you're right. They may have fallen between those stools there, Adam, because they'd be too expensive. And also Peter Grant would be saying, you're just going to make some cheap piece of rubbish. We want this product to be good. And maybe your Warner Brothers and people would see it as being taking too much of a chance. They'd rather make a proper film than make something that had Black Sabbath in it, Yeah.
So we obviously we've been talking about the trials and tribulations of life on the road, and possibly no movie ever made as documented in strict serious fashion the trials and tribulations of a rock band on the road than this is Spinal Tap. a loose parody of Saxon, I believe, was the they went on tour with Saxon for about 6 months, and then just took verbatim.
Yeah, here we've got the reverse of what the podcast is supposed to be about, because it's actors playing musicians, and that shows you how successful that can be. Maybe the film business got this wrong all the time. Maybe they shouldn't have had Mick Jagger playing Ned Kelly or whatever. There should be more of doing it the other way round.
Well, have Ned Kelly play Mick Jagger?
Well. That'd be good. But the Spinal Tap thing, though, is great. Have proper actors who can sort of chug away a bit on guitar. They can pass for musicians and get them playing a fictional band. Maybe that's the way to do it.
Yeah, when they came back to that with absolute Almost Famous with the Cameron Crowe movie, had a fictional band made up of actors.
And they actually rehearsed, spent so long in like a rock and roll boot camp.
And again, that's really authentic. That's another great movie, and one that gets it right, and one that really feels like a proper sort of rock movie, whereas getting the band involved, doing Black Sabbath, the movie or whatever, doesn't always work, as we've said. So
before we move on to sort of like 80s kind of rock band kind of things, one I want to highlight that we've not talked about, which has a musician, but I don't think people really think about him as a musician when he is, but it's Paul Williams in Phantom of Paradise.
Yeah.
I think he was a songwriter rather than known as a pop star, but that was an astonishing movie.
Yeah, well, again, that fits, although it's an American film, it fits right into that wave of British glam rock movies, because it's got Gerrit Graham playing Beef, the lead singer of the Juicy Fruit, and that whole great sort of Frankenstein sequence that they do and everything, and really fits in alongside the Rocky Horror Picture Show. And all
I was about to say the Meatloaf in Rocky Horror as well, we've missed out there.
And we can talk about Meatloaf later on, because he did some interesting stuff, so he's a name that we'll leave for in a few minutes' time, But yeah, Phantom of the Paradise is great, and Paul Williams, I think, is a good sort of screen persona, and he's you look at Paul Williams and you think, well, he's not an obvious person to put in front of a camera, but I think he really works in this film. He's very, very sinister, and he's used in a good way. He sort of represents and embodies that whole record company manipulation thing that we were talking about earlier on. So you've actually got an actor there who is playing that as his part. It's not just a subtext in the background, it's a character in the movie, is the evils of the music business.
So we get to the 80s, and it feels like there's a shift in the 80s.
Well, it's post-MTV for one thing.
Yeah, for a start, yeah. But it does feel like they are picking, instead of like the whole band comes along, it feels like you're picking the lead singer after a certain point, where it's just like, we want to capture something of the charisma of this rock lead singer or whatever, and bring that to the movie rather than have them just playing a role.
I think it's probably, it's MTV time, isn't it? So you had all these concept videos where the singer was effectively acting intercut between live shots or whatever. There was a storyline. So every now and again, someone from the band would take that role. So perhaps that was like dangling the carrot a little bit, or seeing who could actually pull something off.
Yeah, we chatted a little bit about this on the Julian Temple podcast, because he directed a lot of sort of like extended prop promos, as they were called back in the 80s. But all bands had these ridiculously long like pop videos. It wasn't, because when I was a kid growing up, I just figured it was Michael Jackson. Michael Jackson gets to do his Thriller, and that's pretty much it. You occasionally get other ones do 10, 12-minute ones, but like ABC did a 30-minute pop promo, with a whole plot line and storyline and all that kind of stuff. It's like, well, everyone was doing it. It was the de rigueur, I guess, of the day. But yeah, I guess who were the most successful? Prince.
The first ones I remember was, you talked about David Bowie in Labyrinth. He was one of the first ones. And also Sting in Dune. That was one which I remember as one.
Yeah, I remember Sting in Dune. It's a big flop, though. I guess Sting in Dune. So it was
I think the first notable one, which was a big deal for me, was when Madonna was getting into acting. That was the first one where I really took note.
Yeah, Madonna's movie. She obviously she was a megastar at that period, and we did a podcast on the Razzies fairly recently, and they love her on the Razzies. They nominated her every year they possibly could. They nominate Madonna.
That's tough.
I think it is tough. I think Madonna's one of those ones where I think she's never quite done the signature role. Where you look at David Bowie and you think, okay, Man Who Fell to Earth, fantastic in that, Labyrinth. You've got a couple of signature roles there. And when you look at Madonna, you're thinking, well, I guess it's Desperately Seeking Susan is the signature role for her.
I think she was effectively playing the 80s Madonna in Desperately Seeking Susan, wasn't she?
Yeah. But it's not Shanghai Surprise. It's not Who's That Girl. It's, I guess the other one is In Bed with Madonna or Madonna Truth or Dare, which was in the early 90s. But by then that was a different proposition, even though it was a documentary.
Yeah, but fair play to her. I mean, she has stuck at it. She's been constant. So I think she is one of those people who, with stuff you were saying earlier about people in bands, I think there is a few exceptions where there is like someone like David Bowie, who's just an all-round creative person. So it makes sense that he perhaps wants to be in a film or free his creative juices that way. Whereas you say like Black Sabbath or Led Zeppelin, it's like, no, we're a band. Why would we want to be in a movie? Unless it was somebody else's decision. You've got these few exceptions, which are just an embodiment of creativity, like Michael Jackson. They need to express themselves in so many different ways. So fair play to Madonna. I think she's stuck it out.
Yeah, I mean, and she's by no means troubling Meryl Streep for Best Actress ever, but she's not terrible. She isn't terrible. She just brings something to the films that she's in.
It's another one where I think the star is so big. There's just so much like, let's watch her fail. Let's watch her screw up.
I think that's definitely part of it. What do you think, Daryl?
Yeah, all the people that you mentioned there would, I think, used the 80s as a platform for sort of, some of them launched careers in the 80s. Bowie sort of reinvented himself in the 80s, but they all used the new sort of commercial propositions of that decade as a means of sort of furthering their careers. One interesting aspect for me with them is that even though they're playing characters in proper films, there's always this level of audience recognition there. There's always this level of, we know that's Madonna, even though she's playing whatever, a bag lady or whatever it might be, we know who this is. And you don't necessarily get that even in conventional films, in the age of the Hollywood superstar of the sort of 1930s and 40s, you may have had people like Betty Davis and Joan Crawford bringing part of that to their roles. And no matter what character they played, there was always this layer of them and their real lives and their real stardom in there. I think that came back in the 80s, and it came back not necessarily with movie stars, but with pop stars in film. And I think Madonna really embodies that. And as you said, Adam, they're all competent performers as well. And again, that comes out of this thing we've been talking about all the time, that goes back, I suppose, to the 40s, and then we mentioned it in the 60s and 70s, this concept of the all-round entertainer. And I think these people all saw themselves as that. Or the business sort of changed in the 80s. And I think the 80s wanted people to be like that. It wanted people that could move from MTV to television shows to movies, back to records to touring, and bring the whole package. And so it's interesting that the people who became big as movie stars via the music business in that era were, more often than not, these people who were seen as being the all-round entertainer. I think the one exception to that might be Sting. He's more of a conventional frontman of a band. But again, I think the ambition was there within him to, let's see if I can act. Let's see if I can get in front of a camera and do movies. And I think some of his film choices as well are a little more experimental than some of the others. You didn't get Sting appearing in big commercial movies. His persona was a little bit weirder than that. And I think that shows in the film choices that he made.
Yeah, I think as we were talking about just then, megastars being formed in the 80s. I guess you're talking Madonna, Michael Jackson, and Prince's. I think Prince's movie career. So I'm going to talk about Prince now. Prince's movie career is very much all about making Prince a megastar. It's not really about him wanting to be an actor. You know, I think it goes to show on the first, when Purple Rain came out, he had the number one film, number one album, and number one single in the same day.
Yeah. So it's all part of the brand then.
Exactly. Yeah, and to him, I'm not even sure whether the film being number one was that important to him. I think it was important in getting his, because he'd had like 5 albums prior to that. The 5th album, 1999, was a big hit, but it was a big hit in the sense that it sold 3 million records, whereas like Michael Jackson's Thriller sold 12 million records. You know what I mean? And Prince was looking at that, going like, "I want that. I want to be there. I want to cross over from the black music radio stations in America, and I want to cross over onto MTV into the mainstream. And how can I do that?" And he did that via Purple Rain, and he created the whole project. It's a proper vanity project, but with a goal of getting him over.
Yeah. And again, in which he's playing a version of himself, really.
Exactly.
You know,
and
it's not a performance.
No, and I think the canny thing that Prince did, he recognised that what people wouldn't have seen at that point was his live performance. They wouldn't have seen that. You know, they might have seen a couple of pop videos he'd done for 1999, but he was, black artists weren't being played on MTV other than Michael Jackson. So his idea was to try and get as much of him performing in the film as possible. And it's like, I don't know how much of him on stage there is, but it's got to be 40, 45 minutes of a 90-minute film, you know.
Just one big advertisement. For
it completely is. And it's got a loose plot and it strings together. But ultimately you're sitting there waiting for the next performance. And he's not going to challenge anyone's acting talents, Prince. You know, he does what he has to do and gets out of Dodge, as it were, you know.
As you say, the plot is so loose and so sort of based around the music that it could have been done by Billy Fiore or someone in the 1960s. You know, it's still using that 1950s rock and roll movie template.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those things where it's like he's supposed to be Prince versus another band. And there's like 3 bands in it. There's like Prince, The Time, and Vanity 6. And Prince writes all the music for all the bands. So it's kind of like, it's all Prince. It doesn't matter what you do. It doesn't matter if you listen back. It's all Prince, you know. Do
you think that sort of plays into it? This is what I was saying earlier about these layers that are within the persona of the star. You know, there's a sense that he knew that we knew that, and it was all part of the playfulness of the film. The fact that on screen there's supposed to be this competition going on between the acts, and off screen the reality is that, oh yeah, I'm a genius, I wrote it all.
I don't know. I really don't. Again, as we talked about with Madonna, you know, people are aware of I don't know how aware people were that Prince was writing as much music as we do know now. You know, he was writing stuff for the Bangles, he was writing stuff for Stevie Nicks, he was writing stuff for all kinds of different people throughout the 80s, particularly during that period, 83 to 85, 86 period. So I don't know how much that was public knowledge. You know, I was like 8.
Again, might that have been? I suppose there would be a certain level, even at that point, there'd have been a certain level of Prince fan that had bought the 6 albums and that knew all about him. It wasn't, he wasn't the figure that he became later. Purple Rain made him into that figure, of course, but already he got a sizable fan base, and maybe it's a sort of in thing for them, you know, that I'll write all the music for this, and I know that there's a strata of my fans that will recognise that and that will take that away as an extra little layer in the movie.
Yeah, I don't know. It's one of the things. I know he was very...
Adam, why is it that your answer to every question we put about Prince is, I don't know? That shows...
I don't want to speak for the man.
Well, I think that shows what an enigma he was. You know?
Well, I think he was definitely keen on creating what he wanted the world to see as the Minneapolis sound.
Yeah.
Which in effect was just him. But he was spreading it out. He had a girl band, he had a funk band, he had him as the rock stars. I mean, because in this film, he transitioned away and started playing lead guitar. And as we know, you know, he's an amazing lead guitarist. But prior to that, he hadn't picked. He played guitar, but he wasn't known as the guitarist. And then you open up on Purple Rain, and there he is, like a rock star with a guitar, you know, on stage, like all those 70s rock bands, those mega stars, you know. it was a statement, and I think Madonna, it was similar in the sense of like she was just trying to be as big a megastar as she could possibly be, and movies were a natural step for that. Michael Jackson never quite managed that, but he was just so big anyway. It didn't really
saw
matter.
Michael do Moonwalker, and that was effectively like his. Again, it was just an advertisement for Michael Jackson.
Yeah, exactly. So what do we think about these actors, and in particular Prince and Madonna, when later on, having done the sort of showcase movies and appeared on MTV and everything, suddenly they get into projects where they've actually got to act and they've got to play a character. How good are they?
I think Madonna did fine. I never had any problem with any Madonna films. And like we were saying earlier, I just think when the star's that big, and especially from the 80s onwards, everything's just under so much of a spotlight. Any dodgy scene, that's the one that they're going to pull them up on.
I mean, I don't think it's a fair comparison for Prince, because I don't think Prince ever really got offered projects that he took like Madonna or other actors did. I think he always was in control. It's just the vanity project that Prince was doing at that point was not what people wanted or were interested in. You know, so he's making a black and white movie in the age of MTV. Yeah. You know, it's like that's obviously a vanity project for him.
Yeah, because he can. Yeah. Rob, a remark you just made there has raised a question with me, and it's about critical response to these. Do you think that, in particular, movie critics, I would guess, are gunning for people like this, that there's a sense that what's Madonna doing making films, you know, and we're going to be extra critical. Something you just said there made me think that you might want to sort of elaborate on that.
A lot of time, I think people have already made up their minds. It's because I remember when Shanghai Surprise came out, we mentioned that earlier, because it was when she was with Sean Penn. So I remember I don't know if anticipation's the word, but there was a lot of hype, and people are almost like saying this is going to be rubbish, this is going to be terrible, before it had even come out. Whatever your thoughts on the film are later on after you'd seen it, I don't know, but I think there's just like a preconception, and people like to see famous people fail. I think then you do get exceptions, like later on, like someone like Justin Timberlake, who people perhaps didn't expect to see as an actor. I think that just made him more famous, and people were like, oh, cracky, he's pretty good.
One I'd throw in is Harry Connick Jr., which again goes right back to the start, and people like Bing Crosby and Frank Sinatra making films. Here's like the modern day, the 1990s attempt to be that type of crooner type entertainment.
Let's not forget Cannonball Run with Sammy Davis Jr. and Dee Martin. That was fine acting in that. If that's where you want to go for crooners.
Again, you know, the crooners, they might not always be to our musical taste, but often make great movie performers.
They might have been smashed out of the faces and high on coke during Cannonball Run, but it was still a great comedic performance. Yeah,
and again, they go right back to stuff like Ocean's 11, don't they? You know, and the whole Rat Pack thing. So that all came to the movies, and really entertainingly. So
I think there's two strands here we're talking about. We're talking about pop stars who dabble in acting, like Madonna's, who transition to acting. But then you also get people who, I don't think, for instance, like a Chris Christopherson, thinks of himself as one or the other.
No.
I think he thinks I'm a country western singer and I am an actor. And so I think Justin Timberlake's a similar thing. I think he thinks of himself as I'm a pop star, singer, dancer, but I'm also an actor.
Yeah.
Whereas I think Madonna always thought of herself as like, I'm a megastar, and I've done a bit of acting as well to help me become more of a megastar.
Yeah, well, we've been talking about this whole sort of, you know, song and dance man thing and this whole package thing. And I think it's often forced by the industry. They often try and manipulate figures into trying to do a bit of everything. And the two names you've mentioned there, Adam, Christopherson and Timberlake, are people who could genuinely do that anyway. You know, they're people who are genuinely multi-talented, and they don't need the help of the business. They've just got the natural talent. And I mean, Christopherson's a fascinating figure because he worked 3 times for Sam Peckinpah. and in very difficult roles often. You know, he could play the lead, but he could also play very interesting little bit parts. I mean, the scenes that he has in Bring Me the Head of Alfredo Garcia are very, very disturbing, you know, and he's on screen only for a few minutes, but he makes an impact.
Have you guys seen Chris Christopherson in Wheeler, the Stephen Dorff film? So he teams back up with Stephen Dorff from a few years ago. A music film.
I've not seen that, no.
I don't know if it's a film. It's in my top 5 music-related films of all time, along with Almost Famous and Backbeat. But I don't know if you know Stephen Dorff's family are very musical. His dad's a world-famous country music writer, and his brother was as well. So Stephen Dorff wanted to make a music film about Nashville. So rather than going into Nashville as Stephen Dorff, who everyone would recognize, he got all prosthetic makeup on, and they did like not a found footage film, but pretended he was a country music star moving from Texas and trying to break into the Nashville scene. And Chris Christopherson's in that, playing himself. It's a wonderful film, really is.
I love the idea that Stephen Dorff is the least talented member of his family. It just makes me laugh. That
the interesting thing is he actually wrote and recorded the soundtrack for that film as well, and the songs are A grade. It's amazing. Yeah, it's so good.
I would say that without having seen the film, and I now want to see it, it sounds fabulous. The fact that he went to Chris Christopherson as his sort of way into the country music business shows that he knew his stuff. He went to the right guy, you know. Yeah. He went to someone who A, has got a foot in that world, but B, is also a bit of an outlaw, a bit of an outsider, someone on the fringes of country music, you know, a bit of a Johnny Cash type figure. And of course Chris also knows the movie business inside out, as we've just been saying. So the perfect choice, I think.
I mean, again, it strikes me again, why aren't there more metal movies? Because we've got like loads of country and western stars cross over into acting. You get in the 90s, particularly in the 90s and onwards, but it started in the 90s. You had loads of hip hop stars starring in any number of gangster movies, Boys in the Hood style movies.
We want Hanoi Rocks or Twisted Sister or some of the 90s bands in a haunted house.
As I mentioned when I emailed Rob about this, I want a Guns N' Roses Western.
And again, you know, what we were saying earlier about Black Sabbath and Led Zeppelin's management getting in the way, I think any Guns N' Roses project that was mooted, you'd have Axl getting in the way. They weren't even recording or touring for long periods of time because someone in the band decided not to, you know. So, and getting them all together in front of a movie camera, I think would have been an impossibility.
I don't care about the logistics. I want it to happen, Daryl.
There's also the rabbit hole of biopics as well, as in that's a whole nother podcast.
Especially when you get, I suppose the first one to mention there is going back to the 70s and Diana Ross doing Lady Sings the Blues, you know. So you've got a biopic of one music performer with another star in the role, and that's quite often a thing, you know, where they feel the need to cast a musician in the part of another musician.
Yeah, I don't think that
and it rarely works. Works.
Tina Turner, why didn't she do more acting? Because she's fantastic in Mad Max 3. As a sort of like screen presence.
I'm glad you've brought her up, Adam, because I've just been looking down my notes and I've noticed that I didn't mention Ken Russell's films when we were talking about the mid-70s British movies. And of course, he did Listomania with Roger Daltrey, Paul Nicholas, Ringo Starr, and then Tommy, which had Tina in it. So, and she steal that movie?
It's funny. I was talking to a friend. I said I'm going to do this thing, and he says, "Well, what's your criteria? You know, like, how are you going to decide which pop star movies?" And I said, "Well, we'll probably just wing it as we're here." But one of the comparisons I made, I said, "We'll talk about Tommy, but we'll talk about Elton John and Tina Turner in Tommy, but not Roger Daltrey."
Yeah.
And because he's playing a version of himself, I guess, in this thing that he's written.
Well, I like that approach because Roger Daltrey's playing the character, you know, and it's written as a dramatic character. It's not written as a pop star. Whereas these sideline characters, you know, your sort of second string characters come on, and it's all glam. It's all about the music performance. You know, it's all about Elton John wearing the most gigantic pair of platform shoes ever. It's all about Tina Turner making an impression that just eclipses everything else in the film, you know.
Just thinking about some of those actors that we're not talking about Will Smith.
No.
He is a musician, but is he now better known as an actor?
Oh,
he
100%.
probably is. Yeah, absolutely is. But he has still had massive rap records throughout his career.
I think he was like semi-successful as with DJ Jazzy Jeff and the Fresh Prince before did the TV show that took things to the next level, got into movies. Oh, this guy can act. He is a star. And then one helped the other, I think, in a way, the music.
Yeah.
It gets to that point where people will pay enough attention to both sides of it.
And I think there's an ambition and a drive that's been evident in Will Smith's career ever since those early days. And as him being someone who was going to sort of push himself until he got to the top. He's not quite, again, this thing we've been talking about, you could perhaps fit him into that sort of all-round entertainer thing, but I think he's done it in stages, as you just went through there, Rob. He started out as one thing, then turned himself into another and another. And there's always been this sort of drive to be number one and to get to the top in anything that he does. In terms of, is he a good actor? I think so. In the right project, he's certainly got a very good screen presence, and it's not the same sort of presence that a Prince or a David Bowie or a Madonna has. I think there's the sense of a real actor in there.
Yeah,
you know?
I think it looks like someone who's made smart decisions as well. He's took not just a quick grab. Oh, here's a chance to make a movie. You've been offered a script. It's going to give you $3 million or whatever. It's almost like not calculated, but it's thought, is this going to be good for my career? Is this something that I can do well and feel proud about? It seems to be those kind of decisions with Will Smith.
Yeah, and he has a star presence, but it's much more in the line of a Humphrey Bogart, John Wayne screen presence. He's a star.
Yeah, he's a movie star.
Movie star, that's right, yeah.
Do you mean that in the way of like when you see a Will Smith film, you're seeing Will Smith on the screen rather than the character?
Yeah, a little bit, yeah. I mean, it's not often where you watch a Will Smith movie where he's dramatically different.
Yeah,
he's very good, but not dramatically different.
He does play on his persona, but the thing that is different about him is, although he's playing on a particular persona, he's not playing on his pop star persona in the way that Madonna maybe does or Bowie did. You know, it's more you're watching a real actor. You're watching someone who is part of the proper movie business.
I mean, arguably, a lot of those hip hop stars have become very good actors. And maybe it's something about the genre of music that's not as much of a leap from rapping about what they know and their real lives and that kind of stuff to becoming an actor.
Eminem did surprisingly well. I think he surprised everybody.
So we've talked about megastars, and predominantly we've talked about the 80s megastars and things like that. Has there been any star vehicles that have been successful in the last 20 years?
Well, I was on the verge, Adam, before you said all that, of throwing in a recent name. But it's a name that sort of ties in with the history of this type of film. The name is Lady Gaga. And again, she's had a very interesting, very sort of low-key movie career. But again, it could be that she's someone who's she's very, very visual in her look and her persona. She's very visual on stage. So she's almost sort of done the movie thing without being in movies. And then you look at her film choices, and other than the big one, which is A Star Is Born, which again links back to Chris Christopherson had done it with Barbra Streisand in the 70s. So it's A Star Is Born, and Judy Garland, of course, had done it. So it's a big vehicle that for every generation of pop star, you know, and there'll be versions of A Star Is Born going on into the future, long after we're dead, you know. But Lady Gaga, prior to doing A Star Is Born and having the big smash, had been a tiny little part of the Robert Rodriguez universe, and she'd made a real impact in those films. She does a little bit in the Sin City sequel, but it's a little bit that has a great impact and makes you think, I'd love to see her in a sort of modern day film noir, you know. And then best of all, I thought, was she plays one of the shape-shifting personas of the chameleon character in Machete Kills. And again, is one of the standouts in that. Again, she's on screen for about 2 minutes in that, and really grabs that film and throws it at you and says, look, I'm here, this is what I do. And I wish rather than sort of taking the Hollywood dollar and doing the obvious thing and being in a version of A Star Is Born, I wish she'd stayed in that sort of cult arena and done these little walk-ons and done a bit more work with Robert Rodriguez. That's sort of what I thought we were going to get from Lady Gaga. And I like A Star Is Born, but there was this sense to me within that film of she's sort of doing what's expected of her, and that isn't what I want from her.
I don't know. I mean, she did the American Horror Story series, didn't she, as well? But I feel like the Lady Gaga in A Star Is Born is not what people expect from her. I don't think people look at Lady Gaga's pop career and think, yes, this is what I want, and then they don't get that from A Star Is Born. They get a very different type of story.
A much toned down version.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, where I'm saying that she's doing the expected thing is in terms of the size of the project and the fact that she's got a lead role, But you're absolutely right in saying that the character in that story is something that is a shift for her. It is something that's a bit challenging.
I think so. I don't think many people expect pop stars to act in movies that are going for Oscars. I think ultimately it's that. I think then there's an inbuilt, as we've talked about earlier, they're waiting to take them down.
As often happens, and as happened in this case, they win Best Song, don't they? They get to appear at the Oscars and they do the musical, the musical montage bit, and then they win the Oscar or come second in the Best Song or Best Music category, don't they? So.
Yeah, I mean, thinking about Star Beagles the last 20 years, it is interesting to see how people react to their inevitable flops because the pop stars tend to be in a movie and they flop. So you've got like Britney Spears in Crossroads, big flop. You got Mariah Carey in Glitter.
Yeah.
And Mariah Carey, actually, Mariah Carey came back and did Precious, didn't she, in late 2000s, which was a very different role. And she was very good in it, so maybe there's hope for her. How
much of this, again, is down to what we've already talked about the critics not wanting this to happen. Yeah. And so having, as you were saying earlier, Rob, they've almost written their reviews the week before they see the film,
Yeah. I mean, first one that jumps to my mind is someone I thought might have been able to go down a film career is John Bon Jovi. Mm-hmm. I thought he might have been able to cross over. He certainly gave it a good stab in the 90s with
well, he did U571, which he was pretty good in. And
well, I think I was a Jovi fan when I was a teenager, so I'm again back on more comfortable ground here now. But Jovi I think it was an interesting take on it because he took it bloody seriously.
Mm-hmm. It kind of felt like this from like a career point. This is my next logical step.
Yeah, but he did acting lessons.
Yeah,
and the first role he took was like Moonlight and Valentino.
That was kind of like
Kathleen Turner comedy
big vehicle for it. I mean, it was like a Spot Him If You Can in Young Guns 2. I remember.
I remember that as well.
He's got to get shot somewhere. Where is he?
It's hardly a role though, was it?
No.
He was
Emilia, I'll do the
down.
Soundtrack for if you put me in the film.
Yeah. That soundtrack I played ad nauseum when I was a kid. But he seemed to progress. Become comfortable with his acting, become comfortable being an actor, and then took on smaller roles and built up. They never really built to that. I guess maybe him moving on like that coincided with Bon Jovi's pop career dipping a little bit, and they never quite aligned at the perfect moment where they could conceivably cast him in a big role and have the kudos of Bon Jovi as well.
Yeah. In that sense, though, Adam, he might well be someone who makes a surprising comeback in 15 years doing sort of older character parts or something, because he's got the talent for that.
Yeah, I mean,
he's got acting chops. Definitely.
Well, I saw him in was it The Leading Man? He was in with Tandy Newton. He was really good in that. And it showed he had some sort of screen presence, definitely. But I don't know. Maybe he will. Maybe he'll just do another Bon Jovi tour. Who knows? So, is there anybody out there? I guess just to wrap up because we're running out of time and pop stars. Is there any artist, band that you would have liked to have seen in a movie? I mean, Rob, have you got any guys where you think, oh, I would love to have seen them in a movie?
Wow. A lot of my favorite ones have kind of tried. I mean, I was a big fan of Poison, and Bret Michaels did one film which was shocking. He got buddies with Charlie Sheen at one point, and Charlie Sheen was having this low budget movie career. And they didn't
Bret Michaels do sort of like a death row film?
Yeah, Letter from Death Row.
Letter from Death Row. Yeah, I remember that.
And everything.
Yeah,
That's acting. Hair, it really was just a wig anyway. But other than that, I don't know. I don't think there's anyone who I'd actually like to see.
I guess it's one that it's not so much that we didn't see them in movies, but I wanted to see them in more movies. I guess is David Johansen.
Right.
He crops up in Free Jack, obviously, but it's not his finest hour. That being Scrooge, obviously. But I would have liked to have seen him in more mainstream. Well,
he did that great. He was in an episode of the Tales from the Dark Side movie, wasn't he? Which he was really good in. And I love Johansson. Again, going right back to sort of glam rock days. I wish there'd been a New York Dolls glam rock movie in that era that we were talking about earlier. They were the one band who didn't sort of get involved in that, I suppose because they were American and it was all happening over in Britain, really, movie wise. But he's now become one of these people who's actually known by certain generations as a movie star who used to be in a band, rather than be, for me, he's like, the lead singer of the New York Dolls, the king of glam rock, But a lot of people just think of him as a film star now.
I think most people think of it as the Ghost of Christmas Past. I think that's
exactly. Yeah.
Even burrowing further down,
Well, again, I think he comes on and steals that film.
Definitely, yeah.
That's the thing we've mentioned quite a lot during this talk is about what I think one thing pop stars can do is rather than take leads in films and rather than be the sort of big I am in the movie, is come on, do a little cameo, appear in one scene and nail it and end up being the thing that you remember,
That's almost like a smart progression move rather than like, I'm going to be a film star now. I'm just going to try it. And then it just takes people by surprise. Like, they're really good. I wasn't expecting that.
I mean, the one that I just reminded me of another artist that I'm a big fan of that I feel like it's less a case of wanting to see them in more movies and more of a case of trying to find the right director and project to bring their particularly unique persona to the screen, and that's Tom Waits. Wow, like a proper late 80s, early 90s Tom Waits rather than the crooner of the 70s, which we kind of got in One from the Heart kind of thing.
Again, you're right, Adam. He always, if he appears in a film, he always plays himself or a sort of variant on it. But as a character, he's got that thing that he can do where he can play the film character, but there's this heavy element of it's Tom Waits inside, guys, and I'm going to play this in a very Tom Waits-like way, and there is that sort of recognition factor there. And I think that's good for his fans, they get a lot out of that. When he played Renfield in Dracula, didn't he? And played it as Tom Waits, and ended up being, again, the best thing in the film. Not that was difficult in Dracula.
We need kind of like a Tom Waits character for this role, guys. Well, let's get Tom Waits. He can do it on screen.
Why not?
Yeah. Thank you so much. I think we've covered pretty much most of the big guys and the big girls from the music world and the acting world. So
I wasn't expecting to span about 5 decades, guys.
We don't mess around. We don't mess around here. Yeah, we jump around. That's the history of music, isn't it? Pop music, definitely. We've covered. One name we've missed out, I think, is Toya Wilcox. I think she is a really interesting actor, very different to her music, but
and again, sort of started out really sort of wanting to do both, and did both as parallel careers. Yeah. And there's a bit of crossover early on. She was in Jubilee, of course, but then she was in The Tempest for Derek Jarman very soon after. And I think that showed before the end of the 70s and before she'd out of her teens. Really, she's already shown her talent and what she can do.
Yeah, absolutely. And obviously, we haven't covered Vanilla Ice in Cool as Ice.
Oh,
Maybe next time.
Yeah. Well, the reason we haven't is we're going to do a whole 3-part podcast just about that movie.
We're going to do a 3-part podcast on the ices: Vanilla Ice, Iced Tea, and Ice Cube. No. Cool. Thank you so much for joining us, Rob.
Thank you. I've loved it. Thank you for inviting me.
Cool. We will be back in another couple of weeks with another great podcast. Again, I want to thank Quad and the BFI for supporting us to do these podcasts. And also, if you've got any ideas of topics you want us to cover, maybe you out there really, really, really want us to cover the 3 ices, please let us know. Hit us up on our Facebook page, or you can email us at adamm@derbyquad.co.uk. We'll see you next time. Take care.